a young man in the fishing industry trying to make a living, and it's got to a stage where I really don't know whether I want to carry on anymore.
Let us have a much deeper discussion about what is involved, both on the economic and monetary union treaties and on the political union treaties as well.
At least they've had a referendum, which is more than we have had. I look forward to us having one.
Ladies and gentlemen, as I'm sure you can all imagine, a great deal of hard work and enthusiasm has gone into arranging this conference. So many people have been involved, it has been almost impossible to thank them all individually. However, I think we should thank, in particular, the people of Brighton for their hospitality, the Brighton Council, the Referendum Party staff, all outside consultants, contractors, and everyone else who has made this conference so successful. As you leave the hall this afternoon, we ask you to collect a bundle of the Referendum Party leaflets and hand these out to your friends back home. Thank you all for coming. Ladies and gentlemen, the party leader, Sir James Goldsmith.
Well, I just started the ball rolling. From today onwards, I've got a lot of partners. It's now up to you, everywhere up and down the country. I also want to thank Alistair McAlpine for chairing the meeting today and for representing us so thoroughly everywhere on all the programs. We are here for only one reason. We want the people of this land to be able to make the most important decision a country can face, whether or not it should continue as an independent nation. We seek no power for ourselves. We're not politicians, and we don't want to be politicians. We're people drawn from every walk of life, as you've seen today, from every region of the nation, and from every major political party, left, right, and center. Among us are doctors, teachers, businessmen, housewives, farmers, fishermen, others. In other words, a broad representation of the nation as a whole. We represent a broad diversity of views, but we're united in one unshakable belief. We reject the idea that this country's destiny as a proud and sovereign nation can be brought to an end through the backroom dealings of politicians. The sovereignty of this nation belongs to its people and not to a group of career politicians. It is the people, and they alone, who must decide after a full debate and a public vote whether Britain should remain an independent nation or whether her future will be better served as a new country, the single European superstate, also known as the Federal Europe. Our purpose is to obtain that right to decide. And when the decision has been made, the referendum party will dissolve. The issue that faces us is of such enormity that we all find it hard, almost impossible to grasp. As we go about our daily lives in a normal way, how can any of us believe that our history as an independent nation is being quietly and surreptitiously brought to an end? And yet that is what is happening. Consider for a moment the qualities that define a sovereign nation, those that distinguish it from a vassal state or from a mere province of a larger nation or empire. They are the right to pass laws in our own land, the right to run our economy for the benefit of our people, the right to determine our foreign policy, to organize our national security, and to control our own borders. Each of these fundamental national rights has either already been abandoned or is now under imminent threat. When our politicians assure us that they will never allow us to be part of a federal European state, alas, they're not telling us the truth. Already they've signed treaties which have surrendered an indispensable part of our sovereignty. And they did so without explaining the facts and without our consent. Already, laws passed in Westminster are no longer supreme. British judges have confirmed that the supreme law of this land is now European law. Already, we've signed away our right to run our economy for the benefit of our own people. The governor of Germany's central bank puts it concisely. Referring to economic and monetary union, he says, and I quote, "It will lead to member nations transferring their sovereignty over financial and wage policies as well as in monetary affairs. It is an illusion, as you've already heard, to think," he adds, "that states can hold on to their autonomy over taxation policies. So much for our control over our financial and wage policies, our monetary affairs, and our taxation policies." And the governing European political caste has put forward proposals to transfer to Brussels control of our foreign policy, our national security, and our frontiers. This is not a personal view that I'm giving you. The facts are out in the open. Chancellor Kohl's foreign policy spokesman is an honest man, and he speaks clearly. He explains that Germany's ruling party wants what he calls a country, a federal Europe, which will have one parliament, one government, one court of justice, one currency, into which would be fused up to 25 existing European nations, including our own. He goes further. He proclaims that nation-states have already lost their sovereignty, and that that sovereignty, in his words, is no more than, I'm quoting him, an empty shell. And remember, according to the treaties that we have signed, all of this is irreversible. Chancellor Kohl constantly repeats to us that it is irrevocable, indeed forever. Now think about that. In an association of countries, when one of them disagrees strongly with the others, it can pull out, can withdraw. And if the others feel they can't work with that country, it can be thrown out, can be expelled. But in an irreversible union, you can't withdraw and you can't be expelled. It's irreversible. If you don't agree with what the others want, you can only be subjugated. When I referred earlier to the governing European political caste, I was not just referring to continental politicians. The bulk of our own must be included. It was the conservative government which signed away our rights to self-government, and which, through weakness, has systematically given in to the demands of the bureaucrats. The Labour Party, for its part, has just discovered Heath's version of conservatism. Like Heath, it turns its back on the nation-state and favors the creation of a politically integrated and corporatist Europe. The Labour Party is a source of bewilderment. It proposes referenda allowing the Scots, the Northern Irish, the Welsh, the residents of the Greater London area, among others, to express themselves on how they want to be governed. It even puts forward the idea of a referendum on electoral reform. But it refuses a clean, clear, and fundamental referendum on whether the United Kingdom herself, as a whole, should be governed from Westminster or from Brussels. The Lib Dems are uncomplicated. They proclaimed, and I quote, "We are supranationalists." In the European arena, our Conservative, Labour, and Lib Dem MEPs, along with the parties to which they are affiliated, all support abandoning our powers of self-government and campaign for a federal Europe. As for the grandees, the political establishment, they fully endorse the slide to federalism. Only a few weeks ago, one former prime minister, one former deputy prime minister, 3 former foreign secretaries, and the British vice president of the European Commission jointly signed a much publicized proclamation to this effect. But beware, the record of the establishment is not promising. Before the war, it needed Churchill overriding the active hostility of the establishment to provide the strength to come to the rescue of Europe. During the Cold War, it took outsiders like Reagan and Thatcher, or before them Ernest Bevin and Hugh Gaitskell, to provide the guts to face down the threat of the Soviet Union. And now, yet again, the establishment exhibits its habitual weakness. The British people have been offered no choice. No matter which political party they turn to, the result will be the same. To understand what is happening to us, we must both ask and answer the question, how is it possible that our politicians have accepted a constitution for Europe that is so totally contrary to our tradition of democracy. The fundamental premise of a true democracy is that Parliament makes the law, the judiciary interprets the law, and the executive governs within the law. That is the basis of the separation of power. That is the basis of the separation of powers and of the systems of checks and balances on which our democracy is built. Ultimate control rests with the people, who elect Parliament and therefore indirectly the government. The European Constitution is based on a totally different set of ideas. The European Commission has been granted what in Euro jargon is called the monopoly of initiative. That means that only the Commission is empowered to put forward proposals concerning the governance of the European Union. Only the European Commission. Remember when Jacques Delors, the former president of the European Commission, addressed the Trade Unions Congress here in the UK in 1988? He told us then, and he wasn't joking, that 80% of our national laws would be made in this way. The Commission is unique in another way. It is the only institution in a supposedly democratic community which has the right not only to create laws, but also to execute them. That is totally contrary to our idea of democracy. And what is more, the Commission has been granted the right to act in secret, and its members, the commissioners, are unelected bureaucrats without any democratic legitimacy. They are the people that can produce laws which are supreme over the laws passed in Westminster. The antithesis, this antithesis of democracy, is complemented by two other similarly conceived institutions, and they happen to be the two most powerful political organizations in Europe other than the Commission. They are the European Court of Justice and the European Central Bank. In a normal court of justice, it is the judges who are there to interpret the law. The European Court of Justice is quite different. Only a minority of its 15 members would qualify as judges here in the UK. The others are politicians, academics and consultants who've benefited from political patronage. They do not interpret the law, they make the law. The European Court of Justice is a political court with a political agenda. Its rulings time and again are based on principles that the court simply creates and which have no legal basis in the treaties themselves. As one of its former judges, Judge Mancini, has admitted, the European Court of Justice is a court with, in his words, a mission. And that mission is to create a federal Europe. Of course, as is usual in the European Union, it carries out its business in secret, and there's no appeal against its judgments. The European Central Bank also will be populated by unelected civil servants who will have absolute power. They will be subject to no political or democratic control of any kind. That also is written into the Treaty of Maastricht. This particular group of civil servants will dominate all the economies of Europe. Let me remind you that as has already been made quite clear, once economic and monetary union is in place, what happens to interest rates, wages, inflation, growth, and therefore jobs will be decided in Frankfurt. And just think of that. Interest rates, wages, inflation, growth, and jobs. And remember that the governor of Germany's central bank has already told us that we can also kiss goodbye to our control over our financial and wage policies, our monetary affairs, and our taxation policies. What is more, the Eurocrats are now planning a stability pact, which was proposed last year by Germany, and the principles of which were approved by the European Union last month in Dublin. This will mean that Brussels will set the rules also for spending and borrowing, and will establish what is known as broad economic guidelines. Brussels will be granted increased rights to exercise what they call multilateral surveillance. Most of these constraints will apply whether or not we opt out of the single currency. What is more, it is proposed that those who are either in or out of the single currency will be obliged to submit what they call convergence or stability programs, which will be subject to scrutiny by European institutions rather than by our own Parliament. Our Chancellor of the Exchequer, Kenneth Clarke, has agreed in principle to grant that control to Brussels without even seeking the prior discussion by Parliament, by our Parliament. Let us be quite clear. The consequence of all this domination by Brussels will mean that neither the Conservative nor the Labour Party, whichever is elected, will have the legal right to run our economy. So their principal electoral promises and manifesto proclamations are empty of substance. Three committees, the European Commission, the European Court of Justice, and the European Central Bank, consisting of unelected bureaucrats, have been or are being handed almost total power over the lives of all the peoples of Europe. Insofar as we are concerned, the overwhelming majority of those powers has traditionally been in the custody of our Parliament, our Court of Law, and our government. Now they have been, or being abandoned silently, deceitfully, and irreversibly by our politicians and without our consent. We've been encouraged to sleepwalk into surrendering our nation. Let us never forget the assurances given to us by Heath's Conservative government when it took us into Europe. These are the shameful words which we must never forget, and which were printed in his official white paper. I quote, "There is no question of any erosion of essential national sovereignty. Never again should we trust such people." Let me explain how all this has come about. As we know, the construction of the European Union was designed by Germany, assisted by the elite civil servants of France. It draws the bulk of its inspiration from Germany's constitutional heritage. The ethos of that constitution is drawn from Prussia, and Prussian political thought was molded principally by the German philosopher Hegel. So the key to understanding the institutions of the European Union is to understand how the German constitution itself came about. I seek your indulgence to remind you of this essential piece of history, essential to grasping what is happening to us today, essential to understanding how we find ourselves bound by a constitution, alien to everything we have respected and stood for during, as Hugh Gaitskell said, 1,000 years of our history. Hegel, the philosophical father of the German constitutional tradition, believed in the state and despised the people, or rabble, as he often called them. He wrote, and I quote, "The people do not know what they want. To know what one wants is the fruit of profound insight, and this is the very thing that the people lack. We should venerate the state as an earthly divinity," he wrote. He explained that only the bureaucrat is the true servant and master of the state. Hegel considered that elected bodies such as Parliament were only useful to perfect the process of subordinating the people. Prussia began to unify the independent nations of Germany in 1834. At that time, they were still independent monarchies. The first step was to create a common market, or customs union, known as the Zollverein, englobing 19 nations. The peoples of the various German nations were told that its purpose was to form a large and free trade area. After some armed struggles, the common market was converted in 1867 into a political confederation. The peoples were told that this would help to consolidate and to develop that common trading area whilst maintaining substantial independence for the participating nations. 4 years later, in 1871, the trap was closed. The Confederation was expanded and converted into a single German superstate dominated by Prussia. The Parliament was no more than a democratic-looking front, whereas real power was concentrated in the hands of the leading civil servants. The principle of irreversibility was made absolute. No nation could withdraw from this new German superstate. I'm telling you this because it relates directly to the way the European Union has been created. Remember what happened. First came the common market. We also were told that its purpose was to form a large and free trade area. Then we moved on to a grouping of nations. And we also were promised that we would retain essential national sovereignty. Of course, Parliament was established, but real power was also concentrated in the hands of the leading civil servants. The principle of irreversibility was also introduced, prohibiting any nation from leaving the European Union. And now the trap is being closed. We also are being led blindfold into a federal superstate. The French civil servants, who were both the servants and the political masters of the French state, acted as handmaidens in this enterprise. They were flattered, suborned, and rewarded. And they are vain and arrogant enough to believe that by collaborating with Germany, they will become the co-masters of Europe. They seem incapable of understanding that they're just being used. As someone who is half French, let me assure you that one day they will be judged by the French people, the true ones, not the elites, and that the verdict will be severe. That is how the European Union was created, in total contradiction with the fundamental principles of British democracy. It placed all real power into the hands of unelected civil servants and did so with the help of fools, weaklings, and worse. Hegel would have been content. The power of the civil servants will not be polluted by the people. The rabble, as he called them, will have no influence. Well, we are the rabble. And we've had enough. As Edmund Burke said in 1784, there's a limit at which forbearance ceases to be a virtue. We have reached that limit. So we will fight in every part of this nation. And through our example, we'll be present in the struggle for democracy in every nation of Europe. We will field candidates in every constituency in which the leading contender, whatever his party, has failed to demonstrate that he favors a referendum on the fundamental issue concerning our future relationship with Europe. We are not interested in what politicians say. We look at what they do and why they do it. Almost every day I receive letters from members of parliament swearing allegiance. They tell us that deep down, they've always wanted a referendum, and that it would be unfair for us to field a candidate against them. Then we check their voting record, and we find that time and time again, whenever they've been offered the opportunity to vote for a referendum, they've either voted against or run away and abstained. We place no trust in those who put their careers above the interests of their nation. Those who alter their views so as to be re-elected or to obtain promotion. Indeed, one of the big problems that we will face will be that as the nation becomes increasingly aware that it has been deceived, so the leading politicians will change their tune and try to mislead us yet again. Look at Tony Blair. In 1983, he stated, and I quote, "We'll negotiate a withdrawal from the EEC, which has drained our natural resources and destroyed jobs." Later, the Labour Party changed its tune. I quote, "Labour supports progress towards economic and monetary union." Blair followed. He said, "If we want to maintain our global role, we must be a leading player in Europe. Pro-Europeans must be persuaders in the debate about Europe's future." But at the Labour Party conference, Tony Blair vowed to build, I quote, "a new and constructive relationship in Europe." Of course, that was just an elegant way of avoiding the issue. It means nothing. I repeat it, if you can find a meaning in it. A new and constructive relationship in Europe. The questions to be answered, Mr. Blair, are does the new Labour Party believe in repatriating power, or does it believe in a federal Europe? And why is it that the Labour Party is willing to offer referenda on so many subjects, but not on the one of paramount importance? Those questions remained unanswered. John Major, he's also an interesting political phenomenon. In November 1991, he said, "There will be no referendum," and I quote, "because we are a parliamentary democracy." A few days later, he confirmed his commitment. I quote, "The government does not intend to hold a referendum on the outcome of the Maastricht negotiations." A few months later, he repeated, "I am not in favor of a referendum in a parliamentary democracy, and I do not propose to put one before the British people." In May 1994, he said, "I have not changed my mind." A few months later, he said, and I quote, "I made it clear that I did not rule out a referendum." A few days after that, he said, "I have said that I am not prepared to close the door on the possibility of the referendum. On June the 29th, he said, "I repeat what I've said in the House before. I do not propose to rule a referendum out." And on March the 1st, 1996, he said, "I've made it clear to the House on previous occasions that I believe a referendum on joining a single European currency could be a necessary step. My position has not changed." And all this has continued during last week's Conservative Party conference. John Major and Glenn Clark paraded onto the stage holding hands. Michael Portillo proclaimed that the party's three policies were unity, unity, and unity. How's that for a single-issue party? Malcolm Rifkin, our Foreign Secretary, attacked the Labour Party, saying, I quote, "Ask yourselves why Tony Blair and the Labour Party have refused to commit themselves to a referendum. Whilst we trust the people can't trust Labour," end of quote. You seem to have forgotten, Mr. Rifkin, that on the 17th of June this year, you said to the Times newspaper that you ruled out a referendum on Britain's relations with Europe. That was a confirmation of what you said only a month earlier at the Daily Telegraph. Michael Howard, the Home Secretary, for his part, proclaimed that Labour, I quote, "want to sell this country to a federal Europe. We have," he added, "a simple answer to this: never." Those are noble sentiments, Mr. Howard. But how do you reconcile them with the fact that you yourself used to work as a member of the Executive Committee of the European Movement? Let me remind you that it was the European movement which spearheaded the selling of this country to a federal Europe, and did so with the funding from the propaganda budget of the European Commission, and that Mrs. Edwina Currie is now one of the leaders of that movement. And Home Secretary, Home Secretary, have you forgotten that it was your government, with your support, that signed the Treaty of Maastricht, which effectively surrendered this country to federal Europe? Home Secretary, you're reputed to be a skilled and hard-working lawyer, a Queen's Counsel no less. When you voted for the Maastricht Treaty, were you unable to understand the terms of the treaty, despite your great legal experience? Were you unable to understand that Maastricht was selling the country irreversibly into federal Europe? During the Lib Dems party conference, referring to the fact that neither the Tories nor the Labour Party dared debate the European issue, Paddy Ashdown said, and I quote, "So Britain will be asked to vote without knowing what it is voting for. This is a conspiracy perpetrated on the British people by their politicians," end of quote. I do not agree with Paddy Ashdown's policies, but on this issue he is honest and speaks the truth. Are these the people, both Conservative and Labour, that we are going to trust when they make a whole new and contradictory set of promises? And what is more, promises which will be irreversible and will bind the British people forever? Let's now turn to the government's current policy. As we have seen, it calls for unity in the Conservative Party. But how can a party unite honestly behind a non-existent policy? One wing of the party wishes to maintain national sovereignty, whilst the other seeks to integrate Britain into a European superstate. Only those who cannot understand what it means to believe strongly in anything could ask people holding totally different views on a vital national issue to unite. If you cut through the political jargon, this is what the call for unity really means. It means let's just avoid the issue. The government's official white paper, setting out its negotiating position for the Intergovernmental Conference, illustrates the way the government thinks. Its title is hopeful. It's called A Partnership of Nations. The document itself starts well. makes for good public relations. But when it reaches Clause 12, it collapses into the usual compromise and double talk. In effect, Clause 12 explains that the government will not say no to the consensus of bureaucrats. Clause 12 says that the government will concentrate, I quote, on achieving sensible amendments and avoiding pressing ideas which would stand no chance of general acceptance. That's a long way from the Luxembourg Compromise we were told about before when they just said no. In other words, if a sufficient number of bureaucrats say boo, they all fall down. Has the government forgotten that for the moment it still possesses the right of veto which protects our vital national interests? The government, of course, would answer that under the circumstances, its position is necessary. It was one of our greatest prime ministers, William Pitt, who said, "Necessity is the argument of tyrants, it is the creed of slaves." Let me now address a number of questions about the referendum party that people rightly ask themselves. Firstly, the referendum party is a single issue. That's true. A single issue party. It is. But can there be a bigger and more determining issue? The other parties, in effect, have no issues. Their electoral promises are almost totally empty. How can it be otherwise when the very powers needed to make good on the bulk of their promises are being handed to Brussels? Until we've settled the fundamental question of who governs Britain, Westminster, or Brussels, the gesticulations of all political parties are no more than that, gesticulations. The referendum party stands for the issue from which all policies inevitably flow. It is the only issue which counts. And we in the referendum party want the people to decide that issue. The other parties just seek the power of office. But that power will be in Brussels. So they will only get the privileges and not the power. Perhaps privilege without responsibility is what suits them best. Secondly, some suggest that the vote for the referendum party is a wasted vote. Wrong. It's the only vote which counts. A vote for the referendum party is your chance to decide whether Britain will bring home her right to self-government. A vote for the other parties is a vote for Brussels. Thirdly, it is said that it could be disloyal for a member of the other political parties to vote for the referendum party. Wrong again. We are not competing for power with the other parties. We seek no power for ourselves. The issue that we fight for is to allow you, not the politicians, to make the decision that will dominate our future. It is well above party politics. We do not ask people to abandon their traditional parties. Once we've obtained a fair referendum, the referendum party will dissolve. This is written into our Constitution. We can all then return to our traditional parties. And if we've so decided, the parties will once again have the legal power to govern this nation. Voting for the referendum party is your decision, reached in private, deciding whether power should come home. What is more, it provides us all with a guarantee. It ties down the parties. In future, they will have to respect the will of the people. They will not once again be able to promise one thing and do the opposite. And this would be fully understood in Europe. Our politicians would be armed with a clear mandate from the people. The fourth point concerns the claim that we are Little Englanders. The truth is blindingly obvious. The Little Englanders are those who would transform this ancient nation into a mere province of the European Union. If elected, our candidates would form an ad hoc coalition with those MPs of the other party who also favor a referendum. Together we would enact a fair referendum bill, and then we would resign. Now let me pay homage to those MPs from the left and from the right who fought for referendum. They've put nation above party. They've sacrificed their own careers. They've confronted conventional wisdom, and they've accepted with fortitude the consequent abuse. And they have stood firm. They restore dignity to politics. They stand out as honest men, indeed heroes, among so many of their colleagues who float with the tide, trim and alter their views to obtain advancement, and demean themselves to gain easy popularity. It is the politicians who put their career first who reassure us. They reassure us when critics say that we in the referendum party have minimal political experience. Our answer to them is hallelujah. My last specific comment concerns the wording of the question to be submitted to the electorate in a referendum. Now, it would be grotesquely arrogant for us, with nobody elected in this room yet, to go out and say, this is the question, these are the terms of the question. We have no legitimacy to do so. That legitimacy lies in the House of Commons. And when we are there, we will participate in working out those words with the other pro-referendum members of Parliament so as to do it. And for us today to say that this is the question would not only be arrogant, we'd already be acting like politicians. We would be promising something we couldn't deliver. But we are convinced that the question must address the fundamental issues of our relationship with Europe. We must not let the politicians get away with a false referendum. For example, a question limited to the single currency would fail to address all the other vital issues: our right to legislate, to run our economy, to control our foreign affairs, our national security, and our frontiers. Like illusionists on the stage, the politicians, both Conservative and Labour, will hold out their right hand for us to look at. Look at it up here. And in that hand, they'll show you a single currency referendum. In the left hand, well hidden away, they'll hide the fact that all our other major elements of sovereignty have been given away. Just look at the Conservative pledge for referendum. It is limited to the single currency and sidesteps all the really important issues about our independence. As you heard this morning, it requires that the Conservatives win the next general election, that the Cabinet approve it, that Parliament vote for it, not in a free vote but with a three-line party whip. In other words, as was the case with Maastricht, MPs will be forced to vote in favour no matter what they believe. Only then would this limited referendum be submitted to the people. The government would be committed to campaigning for a yes vote its machinery of power and its propaganda capabilities would once again be brought into play. The members of the government would not be able to vote according to their conscience. They would have to support publicly the single currency or resign. And the result of the referendum would only bind the Conservatives for one term. That is the government's idea of a fair referendum. And what of the Labour Party, which the pundits forecast will win the next election? What would they do? No doubt just proceed to federal Europe without a public debate nor public vote. Different method, same result. From opinion polls, it would seem that the people of this country, in varying proportions, hold four principal views about Europe. They are that we should become an integral part of a federal Europe, or be part of a family of sovereign European nations which would cooperate when we can do things better together than separately, or that we should return to being a member of EFTA, the European Free Trade Association, which was our original concept, or finally, that we should just get out. In our view, the referendum should be multi-optional. It should accommodate the existing diversity of views. And as I've said, the exact words would be determined fairly and constitutionally. If you elect members of the referendum party, we will negotiate with the pro-referendum MPs and the other parties so as to obtain such a multi-optional referendum. That will be our purpose immediately. Before closing, I'd like to make a brief personal statement. And here I speak only for myself. The members of our party are free men and women representing a multiplicity of views. If we obtain a referendum, each of our views, obviously including mine, will be just one among many others. We will all be just one voter. What we are at the moment is catalysts so as to obtain a referendum so that we can all be free to express our views and fight for them if and when we obtain that referendum. Here are mine. I believe in a new Europe. I believe that Europe draws its strength from its extraordinary diversity, a Europe that is built on its true pillars, its ancient nations. We would be members of a family of sovereign nations which would cooperate for their mutual benefit. But there would be the strictest possible institutional control to ensure that this spirit of cooperation should never again be allowed to grow into the malignancy which produced Brussels and the other European institutions. Peoples of Europe must be liberated from the control of the bureaucracy, and power should return where it belongs, to Westminster. People ask me why I'm doing all this. You know why. I'm doing it for the same reasons as you are. We just cannot stand by and see this nation surrendered. We're just not built that way. We all know that this will draw on every ounce of our energy, that it'll be costly, that we will be abused, misquoted, and even ridiculed by our opponents. But that will not deter us. We do not fear abuse, nor even do we fear failure, although we prefer success. And we deserve no thanks, because as we see this tragic accident unfolding before our eyes, we are unable to act differently. We have no option other than to fight. Chancellor Kohl has said, as you've heard, that within 2 years he will make European integration irreversible. He stated, and I quote, "This is a really big battle, but it is worth the fight. Chancellor Cole reminds us regularly that by irreversible he means forever. Let me make just one promise, just one vow. We, the rabble army, we in the Referendum Party, we will strive with all our strength to obtain for the people of these islands the right to decide whether or not Britain should remain a nation. And let us borrow from Chancellor Cole's words and accept his challenge. Yes, indeed, this is a really big battle, but it is worth the fight. Thank you very much.